this with our three disciplines, there's always a problem telling where one discipline blends into another, what the fit is. We're very pleased tonight to have somebody who represents two of our three disciplines. Rai Okamoto has his Master of Architecture from MIT and a Master of City Planning from Yale. He was a principal author of a well-known report, Urban Design Manhattan, with some fascinating graphics of access trees within the Manhattan fabric, urban fabric. He has taught at Stanford, Berkeley, MIT, Princeton, Cornell, and other American universities, and has taught at the Royal Danish Academy in Copenhagen and at the School of Architecture in Aarhus, Denmark. He comes to us fresh, from 4 years as Director of Planning for the City Planning Commission of San Francisco. At the time that we announced him, he was still the Director of Planning for San Francisco. And we debated on the car, in the car coming in from the airport this afternoon, whether to introduce him as a victim of planning and politics or a survivor. And I think we'll just settle for introducing him as a veteran of planning in San Francisco, Mr. Rai Okamoto.
Can you hear me? Oh, okay. Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here. I've never been here before, so every new experience, I hope, is something which rejuvenates me rather than wears me down from past experiences. I hope you'll bear with me a bit. I had to discover that some of the slides are slightly out of order. Chalk it up to the perhaps the wounds and the stresses that I have been recently undergoing due to the political or whatever pressures of the previous job. Actually, I've been resting for the past month and a half. I have really no excuse other than perhaps jet lag or something like that. What I'd like to talk about, the loose title that I chose, seems like quite some time ago now, was Whatever Happened to the Urban Design Plan? The Urban Design Plan, which I will spend a few minutes describing to you, is one of those unique documents which, at least we still think it's unique, in San Francisco, which tries to deal with the physical appearance of the city in a very explicit and systematic fashion. In fact, it's a part of our city's master plan, which, as some of you know, I know not all of you are planners, some of you are, many of you I gather, are architects, and some of you may be from other fields. But the master plan is a kind of a policy document that really simply says this is what we in this particular city or region or county would like to be. It does not usually carry with it the force of law. Therefore, it's a kind of a flexible document. The policies in it, therefore, can address, although they don't usually address, things as ephemeral as the quality of the visual environment. A bit of background about our urban design plan, which was adopted in August of 1971. It was the culmination of a unique effort, I think, funded in those days when the federal government was quite generous. At that time, Alan Jacobs was planning director. Some of you may know him. He's now a professor of city planning at Berkeley. And our firm did some of the work on the plan, so I have a rather intimate feeling about it. But it did identify the qualities which we believed made up San Francisco's visual image, and we tried to develop policies which would enhance and, wherever possible, preserve those qualities. Specifically, it sought to enhance the city's image, and some of you who are familiar with the work of Kevin Lynch at MIT understand that term. It's a rather all-encompassing term that incorporates such matters as how you respond emotionally to a place, as well as what you literally see about it, as well as what you know about it, as well as what you remember about it, or what you bring to bear on it from your past experience, your attitudes and values, and so forth. But generally speaking, we think of just how the place looks when we talk about it. At the time, when we were working on the project for Alan and his staff, we were, of course, extremely excited. It was one of those things where, I must say, we were a little bit perhaps too excited about it because we lost a great deal of money doing it. Any of you who are contemplating going into the consulting end of planning should be forewarned that people like planning directors, myself included, have a way of enticing dedicated, young, ambitious consultants into doing things perhaps for a little bit less than they would otherwise do it for. There have been about 10 years then since the adoption of the plan, and there has been, of course, a struggle to implement it. The first effort, of course, followed very quickly after the adoption of the plan. That was to adopt or transfer into the zoning ordinance, which again, some of you may realize is the law and is the planning code, certain aspects of the urban design plan. Urban design plan identified places where it was thought that tall buildings would be perfectly suitable. In fact, had a preconceived idea about where they would be. The notion, of course, being based on the area which traditionally was the most intensely developed, namely downtown. But there was an idea there that tall buildings would, in effect, create a kind of man-made or artificial hill, if you will, to play off or counterpoint the natural hills of San Francisco. There have, however, been a number of failures, I think, in the plan. Some of them were probably beyond our control or due to forces beyond our control. Some of them maybe were inherent in the nature of the plan itself. To some degree, the sheer attractiveness of San Francisco, which I think you'll see in some of the slides, as a place to be, the permissive quality of its social environment, all of these things tend to draw people. There's this magic of going west to escape from the constraining traditions of the East. That's what I did, although I must say that at first I tried to go back because I didn't come directly from the East Coast. I came from Copenhagen, and I somehow or other found Copenhagen a little bit more interesting than San Francisco. But this attractiveness obviously sets up a kind of competition to be there. And when you have a little tiny place that's only 49 square miles with really not very many places where one can build, you can see that it's somewhat like a hothouse or a pressure cooker with people competing, and there's a great deal of stress placed on its infrastructure, its housing, jobs, of course, and so forth, which is an indirect way of saying think twice before you come out looking for a job. Before discussing how the plan has fared specifically, I'd like to illustrate some of the principles and objectives by slides. And bear with me while I get accustomed to your system here. We have the lights, please. Whoops, I've already goofed. Does this reverse? Okay. One more. Okay. Clearly, that is understandable. That is presumably what we're talking about. I think I'll try to do it with the two buttons first. Oh, whoops. Let's say my left is the right and my right is the left, right? Now we're right. Okay. The four headings you see on the left are the four major topics which the urban design plan sought to deal with: city pattern, conservation, and major new development and neighborhood environment. They're generally, I'd say, perhaps self-explanatory, but just to be on the safe side, let me try to define them. The city pattern deals with those big overall form-giving aspects. The conservation, such as, and I'll illustrate those in a moment, big parks, the edges of the city, the hills themselves, the gridiron, and so forth. Conservation, self-evident, I think. We, like many cities, have a resource of buildings, a resource of places, things that we would like to conserve because they give us some sort of a tie with the past, and simply because people happen to like them. Major new development, which is one of the bête noires of the current circumstance, has to do with just that, major new projects, usually high-rise, but as I'll try to illustrate subsequently, also smaller buildings in residential areas, which of course are covered by the third heading, the neighborhood environment. San Francisco neighborhoods are places where people have a great interest in living and have a really extremely humane quality. I pushed both and nothing happened. On the left, you see illustrated the typical edge. This happens to be in the northeast part of the city. Clearly, we want to try to retain that edge and maintain access to it for people on foot, and in certain instances, people in vehicles. On the right, that rather dramatic view looking from above over the fog rushing in shows Golden Gate Park and to some degree the gridiron. The Golden Gate Park again on the left with the typical pattern of residential development that really gives you the flavor of San Francisco's neighborhoods as far as its scale is concerned. Small scale, very tight. Generally speaking, residential areas are built up out of houses on 25 by 100-foot lots. On the right, you have a typical juxtaposition of a few tall buildings with low-rise in the foreground. These are other views of typical hills. On the left, you see Russian Hill. On the right's another view. Both of these are taken from Telegraph Hill, looking west. The church spires in the foreground are actually at the facing a neighborhood park called Washington Square. Telegraph Hill on the left and right. These show different vantage points, different views from different vantage points of Telegraph Hill. It's one of the older residential areas in the very northeast part of the city, and together with the Transamerica building, Coit Tower, which is the tower you see at the top, has become kind of an important landmark or symbol for San Francisco. These are other residential areas and hills. Again, these are the kinds of things which come to become important elements in people's minds about the image of San Francisco, and when they are threatened, I can assure you, after many, many terribly long battles, sometimes lasting till the wee hours of the morning, they will fight about preserving them. even if a little bit of the view is lost by a small projection from a new project. The gridiron here, very evident. It may not be so evident that it warps itself up and over the hills in the most irrational fashion. People like to talk about the fact that is one of the most dramatic and memorable aspects of San Francisco, because it's partly because of what it produces visually, but also because it seems so irrational in a sense to do such a thing. And in fact, some of the newer redevelopment areas out in areas such as Diamond Heights have street patterns which follow the topography and are perhaps less dramatic in their quality than these. Conservation, the second major aspect of the urban design plan, deals with those resources which in part provide continuity with the past, try to strengthen and enhance the qualities of nature, and through those, through combinations of those actions or policies, provide a sense of freedom from overcrowding. On the left is one of the areas along the edge of the coast, and it's one of the few areas that does a number of things, actually. This is around Fort Funston, and these sand dunes actually are very much, in a sense, the way they were many, many years ago. So to the person who pauses and thinks a bit about it, one realizes that this is, in fact, provides a continuity with how things were perhaps before the area was heavily settled. And on the right is simply an example of the ability of people to get close to the water edge, which is a principle that we've tried again to maintain throughout all of the development. And of course then there are traditional landmarks such as these two. Well, the one on the right is perhaps much more traditional in a sense. That's the Mission Dolores on Dolores Street in the sort of central south part of the city. And this arch on the left is all that remains of a major, what was our major marketplace, the produce market, which was finally shoehorned out of there to make way for some of the development that you see in the background, which is called the Golden Gateway, but also is the setting for this small neighborhood park, which is called Walton Square. Then, of course, there are the special kinds of architecture. I think this on the left, I am not a historicist, but I think the one on the left is called Queen Anne. I cannot identify the one on the right, but it is as equally important in a sense overall as the traditional Victorian, such as you see, whole building here on the left and some details on the right. This photograph on the left is maybe a little deceptive. I've taken some editorial liberties here. It's faded somewhat. It doesn't look quite as spiffy as it does in the photograph. The one on the right used to be owned by the Jefferson Airplane. I think they had long ago abandoned it, or left it, let us say. And it is still, in fact, some of us think it looks a little bit better having acquired this sort of pastel appearance. Now these slides, quite frankly, are out of order. But one of the issues which we have been dealing with in the urban design plan has to do with major new development. Clearly, this is major new development, and it was these two buildings, which are twin towers, the Fontana towers, which actually produced the change in policy in San Francisco that led to a 40-foot height limit being established all along the waterfront. And I don't know if you can see in the left photograph right here, backwards, the words Ghirardelli. But that is where Ghirardelli Square, the rehabilitated and adaptively reused chocolate factory, now exists. And exists really as an excellent example of the fact that economic benefit can be made out of low-rise buildings without having to resort to the intense development that was provided, that's provided by Fontana. Part of the conservation effort also involved the identification of certain areas in the city that were unique. Again, judgment was often used. Some surveying took place, but in fact we simply candidly mapped certain areas. For example, on the left you see these 5 areas, which are Telegraph Hill, Russian Hill, Pacific Heights, Buena Vista and Upper Market, and Dolores Heights. Those names may not mean a great deal to you, but that was ultimately, those areas were ultimately mapped a bit more specifically or in a different format on the right, and that was adopted as part of the urban design plan. The fact of the matter is that Dolores Heights, very recently, achieved the legislative status of a special use area, which means that there is actually now legislative recognition of it as a special area. And any projects that are developed or proposed in that area have to go for a special review to the Planning Commission. These are photographs showing some of that character, very rich kind of texture. This is over at the Dolores Heights area. You're looking here again on the right at Telegraph Hill. On the left, looking from the Telegraph Hill area, looking west to Russian Hill. And on the left, you see an interesting building in Pacific Heights. I'm ahead of myself on the right slide, but let's see if I can, got it. Okay, major new development. This is our current and most difficult, well, one of our most difficult problems. As I said before, San Francisco is a place where people want to be just by virtue of its setting and a lot of other factors, but that holds true not simply for residential development, but also for business development too. So when we talk about major new development, we generally are speaking about business development. And the phrase on the right, text on the right, indicates what objectives or what the urban design plan sought to do. It sought to moderate major new development so that the city pattern, all of those sort of big physical, visual ideas that were illustrated earlier, were complemented rather than contrasted with, so that the resources would be conserved. That is to say, you wouldn't unnecessarily demolish or remove an important building if you possibly could avoid it, and certainly you would try to avoid impacting the neighborhood environment. Well, the staff developed some interesting principles which are illustrated in these sort of cartoons here. They're self-explanatory, I think. The idea on the right is a solution to avoid what, or a principle which aims at avoiding what's happening on the left. Namely, if you put high buildings in the valleys or downslopes from the tops of hills, you will soon lose the sense or feeling that there is a hill. So the idea was to accentuate the hills by placing taller buildings on the top. Now this principle actually has come under a great deal of attack, partly during the general hostility that's arisen toward tall buildings in general. But the idea is still incorporated actually in the plan. I think these are also self-explanatory, that a very bulky building is out of scale with relatively small buildings, but a slimmer building, such as we had on the tops of Russian Hill, for example, earlier, is in better scale. The well, the previous slide was an illustration of this caricature here, but the notion is that an extremely large building of this sort is a hostile neighbor to smaller buildings, but when it's mixed in with buildings of its more or less the same size, then it becomes somewhat more content, and the neighbors around it are a little bit happier too. On the right is another example of a building that we thought was somewhat out of scale. That's the famous Jack Tar Hotel, primarily because of its extreme horizontal dimension. As a result of this sort of thing happening, a provision was incorporated into the zoning ordinance that limits the bulk of buildings by controlling the diagonal dimension. Now, another issue that is shown in these sort of diagrammatic slides here is the issue of curiously shaped buildings. I guess that's the best way to describe it. These may look abstract and unreal, but in fact, we do have buildings that look something like this. The one on the right, of course, you will probably recognize as an abstraction of the Transamerica building. The one on the left, I have a slide coming up which will reveal what that one is. I don't actually remember where this one comes from. The one on the right may be a figment of our staff urban designer's imagination. But the point was that when you add them all, when you add them all together, they're probably not, it's a case where the sum is less, the whole is less than the sum of its parts. And so we tried to establish a principle that said that you shouldn't do that. If you have a special building, maybe it should have a special site and be let alone there, and that's that. There is the example of, that's perhaps a living version of the previous slide. Now, you see, in a sense, I mean, of course, some people would argue, well, that's variety, and it's exciting, and it's dynamic, and so forth. But it is something that we thought was not how things should be. It occurs in such a location that it is evident to the view of literally hundreds of thousands of people each year. If this were an obscure location, that would be one thing. But this happens to be Portsmouth Square, which is the major open space in Chinatown. Lots of visitors come here. Lots of residents of Chinatown use the space. And there it is constantly, which I suppose leads one to say, well, you can always look the other way. But in any case. Improvement of the neighborhood environment to increase personal safety, comfort, pride, and opportunity. Sometimes during the last 5 years, as planning director, I would reread these statements and sigh an enormous sigh, because it seemed to me that no one was particularly interested any longer in the essence of those words. But more involved in the terrible crunch to deal with housing and at any cost. At the same time, on the other side, those who lived in neighborhoods and whose neighborhoods would be affected or impacted by new housing were fighting at any cost to prevent the housing from being built. But of course, typically, again, we have a very small scale, small grain in our residential areas, such as is on the right. And of course, this is the typical kind of appearance that an older part of the city will have, where it has not yet been intruded upon by new development. On the right, you're looking from the Bank of America toward North Beach Telegraph Hill, which is to the north and the east, small grained area. Kids in the neighborhood, I don't know how I slipped that in there. But, oh yes, the other characteristic of our our neighborhoods, of course, is that they're extremely diverse, and almost all of them, fortunately, have some kind of open space associated with them. On the left is Washington Square, which is in the North Beach Telegraph Hill area. On the left is Portsmouth Square from a different vantage point. And the other characteristic also, which is very typical of San Francisco's neighborhoods, are their small-scale commercial, really neighborhood-oriented retail activity. This little grocery store on the right is on Grant Avenue, which is one of the main streets that goes through the North Beach Chinatown area. This one on the left is a somewhat more up style or upper income shopping pathway off Union Street, which is in the western part of the city in the Pacific Heights area. The slide on the right shows a rejuvenating kind of rejuvenation of one of the commercial areas. And the other aspect that confronts our neighborhoods, and confronted it in an extreme sense before the urban design plan, or as it was being developed, had to do with traffic circulation. You will probably remember that San Francisco is known for having stopped certain freeways, and I have a slide in here that shows that, in case you never either heard it or believed it. Diagrammatically, this is what we allege that traffic wanted to do, wanted to impact the neighborhood and do something like that, which is on the right. And so there was conceived a diversion kind of technique which would take the traffic away from the residential area, in certain instances screen it by landscape treatments, and we have, of course, here a full-blown, many years of development example on the left and one on the right. Of course, most of these begin more or less like what you see here, Mission Street on the left, and I think that's, I'm not sure, I think that's Union Street on the right. There is a comment I'd make here, however, about this, and begin to foreshadow some of the problems that were faced by either inadequate preparation or inadequate commitment on the part of the city to aspects of the urban design plan. You can see that these are relatively new trees. Those are very young. These on the right have literally, in this photograph, just been planted. This photograph was taken about 8 years ago. Well, if you were to go to Mission Street today, first of all, you would be, I think, disturbed by the lack of maintenance on the part of the trees. You would also find that many of the benches have been removed because there has been a conflict, in a sense, a social conflict, having nothing much to do with urban design, between users of the benches and the merchants fronting on the streets. That will take 2 other hours to discuss, of course. But the other problem is that there just isn't very much money any longer to plant the trees such as you see on the right, and for the city to maintain them. There may, in fact, be the trees available in the nurseries. There may be, in fact, money to plant them, but the Department of Public Works does not have the kind of maintenance money that it used to have. And so, generally speaking, when this sort of thing happens today, it happens only by virtue of a public-private kind of partnership, where the property owners agree or sign some sort of commitment to maintain the trees, or else they don't get put in. The diagram on the left shows a number of different kinds of residential street treatments that are intended to reduce, again, that traffic impact that was illustrated earlier. And I've just picked out one here on the right, which is illustrated diagrammatically on the left, and on the right is what it would look like in reality. Another problem that the residential areas faced, in certain residential areas, San Francisco is, after all, on the West Coast, and the West Coast, as you know, is very heavily auto-oriented, despite the gasoline shortage. And so most buildings have their complement of automobiles, and we have these kind of deadly continuous curb cut situations, which are shown here on the left and the right. What is ironic about the illustration on the right is that from the other side of that building, is one of the most handsome and most desirable buildings on Russian Hill. It has a very, you can see it's called Union Terrace. Well, actually, Union Street is the other side of it, and it has a very handsome courtyard and entryway and so forth. But it has the same flaw, in a sense, that many of the residences have. And this just simply symbolizes our traffic situation. On the left is Lombard Street, which is, after all, nevertheless a commercial street, but the street on the right is Fell, which goes through a residential area. I understand Donald Appleyard spoke to you some time ago, and Don did a study of the impacts of traffic through residential areas, and the findings were perhaps could have been anticipated, but confirm the fact that family life, neighborhood life was next to impossible along streets that were major traffic carriers. Here we see an example of the impact of the freeway on one of the most important urban design features in the city, our city hall, which is modeled somewhat after the Invalides in Paris, where Napoleon's tomb is. On the left, at a distance, perhaps, doesn't matter too much. This is a telephoto lens. Nevertheless, we're back at a higher elevation, but as soon as you come down to Earth, so to speak, what happens is what you see on the right. And of course, this symbolizes San Francisco's response to the freeway during the period when it was a bit more aggressive about such things. These two photographs are just intended to contrast, in a way, as dramatically as I can, the attitudes that were contained in the urban design plan. On the right, of course, is the famous cable car, which will have to be shut down shortly to have some major repairs. And on the left, of course, is the commitment to the individual vehicle and so forth. In this instance, out near Candlestick Park, which is our big sports stadium. It is not to say that the urban design plan ignored the automobile and would favor returning to a complete cable car system, but the cable car, in a sense, symbolizes not only a more efficient way to carry people, but it also was an example of, again, making use of that kind of an object or a system which extended the person's awareness of the city back into its past. Got that on. These two slides pertain to open space, and although, as you can see from the title on the right, this was incorporated in the urban design plan to strengthen the pattern of the city through visually prominent landscaping. It was also, go back. Backwards. It was also this survey or analysis that of open space needs that led to the passage of a very, very important implementation action, namely the passage of an enormous bond election, which has enabled the city to purchase open space, new open space for the first time in a while, here we are, that serves first and foremost those areas of high need. Now, what are shown here in this sort of light orange color on the left, thanks, are those areas that have low access to open space. Well, you don't know that much about the land use distribution of the city, but except for the portion which is in this part of the city here, most all of these other areas actually are residential areas. So those were residential areas which in the early 70s it was determined really were not being served by adequate open space. The plan on the right shows, again, how to strengthen the pattern through visually prominent landscaping, but there was a comparable document which showed where we should be acquiring open space to meet the social needs as well as the aesthetic needs, and that program has been one of the few major successes emerging from the urban design plan. Now, in the residential area, which is again really what neighborhoods in San Francisco are mostly made up of, the urban design plan called for a number of very, very laudable principles having to do with maintaining the scale and character of the existing housing, dealing with the specific sometimes of preservation. But what was really happening was that the demographics of the situation were modifying so that it was becoming much more lucrative for merchant builders to demolish some of these old buildings in the areas, in residential neighborhoods, and build the sort of thing that you see on the left and the right-hand side. Now, on the left-hand side makes one point better than the one on the right. On the left, what you have are really two lots being amalgamated into one, two 25-foot wide lots being amalgamated into one. And so a much bigger building is being built compared to the small Victorian on the right. The slide on the right illustrates something more about the juxtaposition of modern architecture and older styles. And of course, I would think everyone would agree leaves much to be desired. On the left, you have an example of what was done by builders when they thought they were in the spirit of the existing character. You can't see it, but perhaps from where you are, but there are some decorative appendages on the balcony, on the bay windows, and the building on the right sort of combines both the problem of scale and the problem of misinterpretation of the bay window idea. And in any case, the bay windows on the building surrounding it, the new building, are of a different character, and that was missed completely by that contractor. So there was a great deal of effort put after the fact, after the urban design plan, utilizing, for example, this kind of a project that's shown on the left, which does, in its own way, really reflect the scale of the surrounding area and avoids the catastrophe, which is that on the right. And we were able to get some examples, these are here really to contrast, such as this project on the left. This is by an architect called Dan Solomon. And although you might argue that he didn't really have to use shakes or shingles to achieve the character, it does appear to be somewhat more in scale with the surrounding Victorian buildings. The curb cuts are reduced to a minimum by consolidation of the garage entrance into one opening here. The entryways are broken up so that there's a sense of the individual street project by the same architect. Much more in scale with the kind of thing that you see on the right. You can see here on the right the various entryways. This sense of an individual entry, even if they were serving, even if the entries were serving more than one family, was very typical of the pattern in San Francisco residential areas. This project on the left is interesting, and I won't really spend that much time describing it, but it is an infill project. This area in which you see the model was sort of an underutilized, partly parking, partly simply just a kind of refuse collecting area that had for a long time been thought to be undevelopable because of this cut you see here, which is where the new transit system, our so-called Metro Muni, has been built. And this is where the pedestrians underpass a service road which goes across like so. In this case, the architect and an ordinary merchant builder collaborated to produce this project, which you see illustrated here on the left and right. These are two more examples. Sometimes this architect tends to be a bit trendy. That's the case on the left. Those of you who are familiar with some of these forms might find that out of the most recent, whatever, AD. But again, the number of curb cuts has been reduced somewhat, so, and street trees have been introduced. And this was on a small alley where there was before a warehouse that was no longer being used. The building on the right is a much more traditional kind of infill. The other point I'd like to make, which this combination of slides shows, has to do with commercial neighborhood retail. We have, with our neighborhood retail and commercial, a similar kind of thing happening as has been happening with the residential areas. They are highly desirable. They are competed for very sharply. And sometimes the results are detrimental socially and economically, which is to say that you sometimes have gentrification, if you understand that term, commercially, and other times you simply have loss of the existing character, even if the price level, say, of the goods that's coming in is the same. On the left, you have the typical kind of corner shop. On the right, you have a branch bank, which is able to outcompete the sort of project on the left, the existing neighborhood serving, in this case, liquor store with some vegetables and so forth. You also have, of course, security architecture. So the only thing that animates this corner is this little walk-up window here. Otherwise, it's kind of a blank exterior, whereas here you have all the display of the food and so forth, and even, in fact, a space that's penetrable at the corner behind the corner column. Well, we have about 6 or so similar neighborhood commercial areas that are undergoing the same kind of intense revitalization. And it has led to this kind of contrast. Actually, it hasn't happened yet in the neighborhood on the left. This is Union Street, and you can see this sort of rich, ornate kind of quality, which many people like, and many people say that's fine. We don't want to tamper with that. That's natural private market rehabilitation, improvement, and so forth. But at the same time, it's appealing to a regional clientele, not to the neighborhood folks any longer. And what happened there was that the urban design plan was not able to control that. There were additional studies and different techniques needed to deal with that. And there was a series of so-called special use districts created wrapping around all of these various neighborhood commercial areas, whereby when a proposal is made in those areas, the proposal comes before the Planning Commission. These are somewhat more traditional, much more traditional than these, for example. Finally, and if you'll bear with me, I'll try to speed up. We come to the major downtown area, and these slides attempt, I never seem to be able to find the exact vantage point that the previous photographer took his photograph from. But these are actually slides showing downtown from more or less the same southerly vantage point, but several years apart. This, of course, is the Bank of America building, and this is a small building that you maybe can recognize here. And here's the Bank of America. However, you will see that this building is new and doesn't exist there. This building is not in the picture, and you can't really, well, in fact, the Transamerica building is not yet in here. My point simply being that in the past 10 years, there's been an enormous growth in downtown San Francisco, and perhaps this shows some more of it. The photograph on the left being later than the photograph on the right. The building that's common to each is this, which is the so-called Hall of Justice, right here. This is a new building, the Hilton Tower, which is not in the picture here. This is the St. Francis Hotel, also not in the picture. I'll just go through these fairly quickly. These are recent. You can see downtown on the right, really clustering together. One of our concerns is that all the buildings seem to be about the same height. And in a recent visit to Los Angeles, I noticed that all the downtown buildings there seem to be of varied height and look very romantic and dynamic, and I was appalled to think that they might be able to produce a better overall urban design than San Francisco. But that seemed to be the case. Now, what these pictures show, or what, and here the light pointer is very useful. This photograph on this side is taken from Russian Hill, looking sort of east and south. Here is the Alcoa building. Here's the Golden Gateway, and here's the first building of the so-called Embarcadero Center development right here. And it is, in this photograph, this building here. Now there are three others marching along in this direction, so that the last one, if this photograph were completed, would obliterate your view of, from this vantage point at least, of the ferry building. And if you were up here, this happens to be from a small park, a mini park at the top of Russian Hill, you would no longer be able to see that much of the water beyond, or that much of the hill beyond, and I think you would not be able to see that much there. Now that, that isn't a great amount, but it is completely contrary to the principles, again, of the urban design plan, that you should try to retain, particularly from those places where people can go and stand and sit and look, try to retain as much view as you possibly can. Well, the story behind that very quickly is that that is a redevelopment project. That project was conceived before the urban design plan. The commitments, the contracts, the agreements, and so forth were signed well before the urban design plan, well, not well beyond, actually maybe a few months or a year. But today, that development, which now marches along here, and which, of course, everyone thinks of as being very exciting, and is in a certain way very exciting. It has multiple use at the ground level. It's much more lively than most. It's designed by John Portman, and all of those good things. Anyway, it wouldn't be able to happen today because it would be frankly illegal. You couldn't do that. And one of my planning commissioners actually went to court to try to stop it. However, he lost. These are obviously wide-angle lens photographs intended to kind of editorialize a bit about downtown, but they show, this one has now been completed. This is the so-called Shackley building. It actually is a bit more interesting than some of the other new high-rise. It's right on Market Street. This is an older building. This is a Wells Fargo building. But I showed this to show the enormous difference in scale that's developing. Although this is distorted because of the extreme wide-angle lens, the impression that you have as you move around now in downtown is very much that there is now a kind of discordant scale, again, all of which was not really expected to occur if we really had an urban design plan. It was a bad day when I took this. This is sort of a view from the back side of Market Street, which is the so-called south of Market area, where a lot of development is now beginning to move, and a view that you don't often see at this level. You often see it from the freeway, but not from that level. This is again a bad day, no sun, but this was a sort of a gift to the pedestrian. This is the corner of Market Street and 2nd. The architect for this building was Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. And this does facilitate pedestrian movement. It is one of the amenities that we try to get in the urban design plan on the basis of incentives. But at the same time, the overall architecture tends to set up these kinds of almost vibrations in the treatment of the facades, which can be disturbing. Now, what have we been trying to do? Okay. Here, for example, this is only an example because there are many, many things to do, and this is the, I guess, what you might call an ad hoc example. The same architect, Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, had as a client the Crocker Bank headquarters. That's one of the biggest banks in the city, if not the world, I suppose. Market Street is here. The building that I just showed you before is right on that corner. And we were looking this way. And the existing Crocker Bank headquarters is on this corner here. You're turned around looking at another model in this picture. But again, the building that was in the previous slide is here, and the existing Crocker headquarters is there. The architects proposed originally to build a 700-foot building on this site where the height limit was 500 feet. And that is what this particular model shows. It shows a 700-foot high building. It shows, you can't see it perhaps in this view, but it shows demolition of the existing building on this site down to the roof level of the Renaissance-style banking room that exists there. That's this base here. What happened was, and I don't know whether this is an example of how to do urban design or not, but let me go a little bit further before I tell you how it happened. This is a model. This is, again, the original proposal. There is the base that would be kept. There is the 700-foot high building that was proposed to be built in the 500-foot high limited area. There's another view of it. And it had some very exciting amenities, most of which I'm happy to say are being retained. For instance, this galleria that would connect through to the next street, which is shown in both of these models. What happened was, and I must say I have some mixed feelings about how this came about, but the matter was taken to the mayor's office because the developers were concerned that the department, which is my staff and myself, were not moving quickly enough about this important project for this important client in the city. And lo and behold, the mayor said, this is a meeting I was not at, so I don't know if this is verbatim. You have to abide by the law exactly as everyone else. So off with 200 feet, just like that. And so the next time I met with the architects, they showed me this scheme, which was now 200 feet lower, which therefore was legal, and which meant that the thing could move more smoothly. But amazingly enough, the developers also found that it was economically feasible to continue to take down the existing building here and retain the Renaissance banking room. Now, originally, when we talked about that, they said, well, if we have to reduce the height of the tower 200 feet, we will not be able to take this down, and we won't get this rooftop garden here, and the public will lose a certain amenity and so forth and so on. Well, maybe it's the message is that urban design is sometimes politics. I guess that's the message. This is what the street in part looks like. This is the existing headquarters. This is the Renaissance building. This is the street as it presently exists. And as you can see, they would replace the shops, the street-level shops along here in the new building. So basically, I think that the project will emerge as a good project, but it was well beyond the scope ever contemplated, in a sense, by the urban design plan. The other major approach we proposed to take that would have strengthened, or I believe it would have strengthened the urban design plan, was a downtown conservation and development planning program, which I tried to advocate literally within about a month after I arrived as planning director in 1976, but could not get any money for until I think it was 2 years ago. One of the conservation groups threatened a public referendum to lower the height limit. And lo and behold, suddenly we got $70,000, which is hardly very much, to hire Sedway Cook to do a small preliminary study. As you can see, this is called Phase 1. I won't go through all the details. This is just really to illustrate for you, those of you interested in the technique, so that we can talk about it later. But what it tried to do was to compare, and I think some of you have heard about this also from Don Appleyard, compare what was called Proposition O and the existing zoning and some alternatives to see what the likely consequences might be. Now, we did try to be very objective. I mean, some people thought we were, well, the people against Prop O thought we were playing politics one way and vice versa and so on and so on. In any case, this is the study area downtown. The tables here simply show the amount of land that was available in downtown. If you look over to the right, you'll see total acres 167. And somewhere over on the right-hand side there, you'll see employment statistics, some 275,000 office workers anticipated over the future. The message in all of this was that we were running out of space, and what was going to happen, how could it be contained, what would be the impact, and how could we deal with it. The two colors here represent the building capacity under our existing zoning. That's the darker, sort of brownish red. Under Proposition O, clearly there was less building capacity. If you can see the chart on the right, we broke the area down into various growth areas, and this purported to show what the likely possibilities were for absorption of growth in those different districts. Now, one of the key points that was made in this was that in this area here, which happens to be the last remaining section in downtown San Francisco where there's any kind of low-income housing, namely the Tenderloin, North and Market area, there would be a great deal of long-term growth occurring under Proposition O. Clearly, the Proposition O advocates didn't want to hear that, but I think we proved that that was one of the flaws of that proposal. These just show historic resources. These are actually two parts of the same map. You can see that in this is the existing built-up area, Montgomery Street Market. That Crocker Bank building was here. There is a great saturation of historic resources in the existing area. Therefore, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, we have hypothesized since then that in terms of further growth, we should leave this area alone. And if there is to be further growth, it should be in areas, for example, south of Market, where there is, first of all, there are very few people, if any, living, at least in this area, and where there is less impact on historic structures. These graphically portray the anticipated increase in traffic. As you can see, there was soon going to be just literally no way to bring any more traffic in and out if the growth projections as calculated were reasonably accurate. And these are some urban design studies, again, based upon those growth scenarios. In the upper left, you see under Proposition O, things would be sort of spread out, so you would retain a certain view. Under our existing zoning, which still exists, by the way, buildings would pop up this high, and in fact, you would cut off a lot of the view. This is a similar view taken from the south, looking back at the city from the so-called James Lick Freeway. Under our existing zoning, buildings would pop up and block the view of other buildings, whereas, so there might be a trade-off here. In this case, you're simply developing more compact high-rise downtown from this vantage point, but from this vantage point, you're eliminating any view through the downtown to the south. So those are the kinds of things to worry about. Now, we asked Donald Appleyard at the University of California Simulation Lab to run analyses of these alternatives on their lab using a model, and then, as I think you have heard, they made a film of it, which we used. And this is an example looking back toward the Transamerica building here in the foreground. This is under Proposition O, I believe, and this is under our existing zoning. Our existing zoning tends to be tighter, higher. Prop O tends to be lower, but a little bit more spread out. Those seem to be the trade-offs, and I think, if anything, what this does show is an innovative way of dealing with this kind of urban design issue. But again, we didn't have really very much money to go very far. This is looking from the west down Market Street, which is here, City Hall here. This is existing zoning. You can see a lot of high-rise towers marching up and down Market Street. Over here, they spread out and leak into the south of Market area here, and leak over into the Tenderloin here, whereas they don't do that in the existing zoning there. The last slide on the right simply describes the process. I'm almost finished. And I have one more series of slides that are intended somewhat less to be maybe substantive, if I can use that planner jargon, and hopefully an attempt to leave you with a little bit of a little less heavy. Well, some of these are still attempts to make the point. Clearly, the urban design plan cannot deal with something like that. I mean, that's just simply nature given, and if we mess that up, well, we deserve it. This is during the daytime, nighttime. I mean, all these things are what make people fall madly in love with San Francisco, and really, the urban design plan can't do very much about it. It will look like this romantically, beautifully, even if there are lots of high-rises, I'm sure. But another thing that the urban design plan, and in fact the zoning ordinance can't deal with, are places like this. These are the so-called Filbert Street steps. And I was always dismayed when we would get new projects being developed in the few remaining portions of the city where they still hadn't put in streets and so forth, that you couldn't do anything like this. You'd have to have a 60-foot wide right-of-way. You'd have to have certain curb profiles and so forth and so on. So you can't deal with this. And yet this is what we said we wanted to keep, this kind of thing. This is a lane that works off of it called Napier Lane. This is another one over on Russian Hill. You can't, of course, design things like this either. And you can't plan for I think this was improvised, this decoration of the freeway. Now, this series here are some some comments. I found these on these sort of very elegant graffiti, as you might imagine. They were in London. They are redeveloping Covent Garden, or they were by now. Maybe it's done. And the comments I thought by, I suppose, the citizenry were very apropos for anyone presuming to be an architect or a planner working on such a project. This one I thought one day I might send to Jerry Brown, but I haven't got the nerve yet to do it. This one was for me. The worst thing that can be said about a civil servant is that he is emotional. That was said about me. This is one I really liked. It happens many times, many times. And we all have to worry about this, I suppose. And finally, so the only way that you can avoid all this is to remember that you are dealing with the people, little kids who play, and happy guys like that. Thank you. Sure. Yeah. Any questions?
Are there any questions?
When's pilot due, like 2 weeks or
Well, the main thing that was done was the height and bulk regulations, if you know what that is, were changed. That is to say, where the urban design plan said there should only be a certain height, we finally decided, or it was decided what that height would be, and that became part of the zoning ordinance. Those, by the way, are the subject of this great controversy. Are they too high? Should we have any at all? And so forth. LA, by the way, doesn't have any height limits, and maybe that's why they have such a varied height. The bulk, however, I think is much, much more important. Bulk and the floor area ratios, because they have to do with the density. But all of that has been transferred into the zoning ordinance. So in theory, the building envelope that you could now build under reflects the qualities that were in the urban design plan. The other thing was the so-called downzoning of the residential areas. It became obvious that the residential areas were going to have these big, bulky apartment houses popping up simply because you could accumulate 3 or 4 lots, and the zoning, even if the urban design plan didn't say it, the zoning allowed you a higher density. So what that did was to shrink the zoning envelope down to the existing size of building in the residential areas. So you now have, for instance, where you might have once had RH3, which means 3 units per site, or RH4, you now have RH2, sometimes RH1. So we've actually lopped off an enormous amount of density that could have taken place. Those are the 2 major things. All the rest are still kind of negotiation, principles, you know, hassle factor, and that sort of thing. And it's being restudied at this very moment.
Rai, in the newly developed areas, is any of it being done in a grid plan, or is it being done in a
Well, the Diamond Heights redevelopment area is all contoured. The Western Addition, which is a redevelopment area that preceded it, is grid, but there are a lot of super blocks too. It is not that really persistent, relentless kind of grid that we have everywhere else. And you know what Golden Gateway is like. That's sort of a big super block. There's a new area, anywhere where it's not redevelopment, it's simply carrying out the grid. I'd say, essentially. I mean, there's some places where they have to do a little.
Would that be your choice?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, I would. Oh yeah, I would. I'm one of those who thinks that it would be, with certain exceptions, it would be better to just grid it off and let the same fine grain thing take place. It just is not easily done, apparently. Although we're coming up now with a new, there's a new residential redevelopment area near the waterfront, south waterfront, and we don't yet have a design plan for it. Now that might very well, that will be primarily residential. That may have a traditional grid. It's relatively flat, so you know it won't be that dramatic.